Hello and welcome. I'm Jason L. Jones and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. Ukraine's losses from Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea amount to $72 billion. These losses had been caused to the restrictions of the usage of the property and violation of property rights of Ukraine. Today, we're going to find out if under these existing conditions, it's possible to protect cultural heritage in the illegally annexed Crimea and how. To answer these questions, we're joined in the studio by Kateryna Busol, lawyer at the Global Rights Compliance. Hello. Thank you, Kateryna, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. So, first and foremost, what are the international resources that Ukraine can use to help protect against cultural misappropriation?
Well, these resources stem first and foremost from the qualification of what's happening in Crimea. And we know that under international law, Crimea is occupied, and it means that there is an international armed conflict. So basically, we're looking first at all international legal instruments that apply to the protection of cultural property in occupied territories in the international armed conflict. So there is a specialized convention for that, the Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict, and both Ukraine and Russia are parties to that. And the convention says expressly that the occupying authorities, they do not have the full choice of action with respect to cultural property. So basically, they're on the contrary bound to consult the actual state that owns the territory as regards what has to do to be done there to protect cultural heritage. They may take certain extra measures in cases of emergency, but obviously no illegal, unlawful, unsanctioned transfer of cultural property is allowed. No unlawful archaeological excavations are allowed. And these principles enshrined in the mentioned Hague Convention, they are also the principles of customary international humanitarian law, meaning the international law of warfare, of the conduct of hostilities, and of the number of other international legal instruments. So basically, Russia is bound to cooperate with Ukraine on the issues of cultural property in the occupied Ukrainian territories.
Okay. So, is it possible, with that in mind, is it possible to, send someone out there via humanitarian organizations to protect these, may oversee the protection of these cultural sites?
Well, we understand that Russia exercises the full control over the territory, and any involvement of any organizations there, be they governmental or non-governmental, is to be sanctioned de facto by the Russian authorities. But obviously, the de jure sanctioning should also come from the Ukrainian authorities as well. We're hoping to have a UNESCO mission, but again, there is the question of who allows the entry and who grants the security of those who are going to conduct the mission. There are also other options on the international law when both parties to the conflict agree upon a person or several persons who would conduct the monitoring. But again, there is the issue whether we have the political will of both sides, and especially of the Russian side, to allow the presence of such a person. There have been instances of having such monitors, for instance, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict a couple of decades ago, actually. But as of now, I haven't heard of the Russian authorities being ready to agree upon such a person. So at the moment, I think the best strategy that Ukraine could have would be to count on the evidence which appears in the media, including through the Russian publications, as to what they're doing to the cultural heritage in Crimea. And on the basis of that, they might have the claims through the international organizations, raising the issues through UNESCO, for instance. They might also submit that as evidence to the International Criminal Court, saying that Russia is allegedly perpetrating the crimes with respect to Ukraine's cultural heritage. And of course, the Ukrainian side can also have, and they do have, the domestic investigations into the alleged violations.
Okay. And you said this, so Russia, there's a possibility that someone could be established there to monitor these things. Would it be on the Ukrainian or Russian side that they could agree, or what's the? Is it possible to say, hey, Russia, can you have one of your people that's kind of in charge of this type of thing report into us, or work with some outside organization to make sure that these sites aren't damaged?
Well, theoretically that could be done, but Russia is not the authority to allow that. So we've got the question of authority here. So I think as of now, the best approach would be to show that Ukraine is using all available mechanisms in good faith. For instance, that Ukraine proposes having such a monitoring person, but then Russia denies the entry of such a person, or denies providing these specific reports, say, to the UNESCO authorities. And the documentation of the alleged crimes and the submission of the necessary evidence to the International Criminal Court, for instance, could be useful. And we've got actually quite practical results in this domain, because the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is conducting the preliminary assessment of what's happening in Ukraine. Okay. They don't have the full investigation yet. They're basically just examining the factual background of what crimes are allegedly being committed in Ukraine. And in the annual report, the Office of the Prosecutor, which it issued just a week ago, the Office of the Prosecutor said that there might be an alleged crimes of the appropriation or damage of property, including cultural property in Crimea. So it's also a good sign for Ukrainian human rights activists, Ukrainian investigators, prosecutors to understand that they should consider submitting more evidence about such crimes to convince the prosecutor to actually open an investigation and to look into these violations concerning Ukraine's cultural property in more detail in the actual criminal proceedings at the International Criminal Court.
Okay. And is there any, to your knowledge, have there been any damage and violations already done to any cultural assets in Crimea? And if so, what can Ukraine do about that?
Yeah, going by the information available in the media, including published by Russia, they have lifted much of Ukraine's underwater cultural heritage while they were constructing the so-called Kerch Bridge or the Crimean Bridge first. Second, there have been numerous reports about the removal of the artworks from Crimean museums to be exhibited elsewhere in continental Russia. I think the most apparent example would be the paintings and the works by the painter Ayvazovsky taken to the Tretyakov gallery in Moscow. And this is not allowed to do so. So the occupying authorities might only move the cultural property from the occupied territories for the sake of preserving it in the situation of emergency, and then they're bound to return it. And obviously, the exhibition is not a situation of emergency. Yes. Yeah. Then we have a very unique issue of the destructive restoration. This concerns the Bakhchisarai Palace. This is the major and I think the only remaining architectural piece of architecture, the palace of the Crimean Tatars, of Ukraine's indigenous peoples. And Russia alleges that the palace needs some reconstruction, and they're conducting it in a manner that basically erases any historical or cultural value. So they replace many sections of the palace with materials which are too new, too contemporary, to kind of reflect the historical value of this palace. And there have been numerous calls for actions on behalf of the people from the cultural field, museologists, saying that this is basically the destructive restoration, which is also, it hasn't been agreed with Ukraine, and it's apparently against any rules of restoration. And also the issue of the so-called black unsanctioned archaeology is the issue for Crimea, because to conduct the archaeological excavations, one has to receive a permit from the authorized authority. In the case of Ukraine, that would be the Ministry of Culture and the affiliated institutions. But obviously, they haven't been asked to issue such permits and they wouldn't grant them. And we know from the news about Crimea that unfortunately the archaeological excavations are quite widespread there and they're not sanctioned by Ukraine.
Oh, that's a shame. Well, thank you so much, Kateryna, for your insights. I wish we could go into it more, but we ran out of time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Hopefully we can have you back again soon.
Thank you.
Okay, so that was Kateryna Busol, lawyer at Global Rights Compliance. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more.